Boa tarde. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very pleased to have you here for today's webinar on green hydrogen, the missing link in the renewable energy transition. And this is a focus topic for the Portuguese market. I would like to kick off with a bit of an introduction. And for that, so that you know, my name is Lorena Nieuwenhoven, and I'm a project manager at Solarplaza, and I'll be moderating this webinar. And with me, I have three amazing panelists that I will introduce very shortly. But for those who don't know Solarplaza, we have the mission to positively impact the world by accelerating the sustainable energy transition with content webinars such as this and high-level conferences throughout the world for different markets. Speaking of conferences, on the 8th of July, so just over 2 weeks, we will be hosting our Solar Market Parity Portugal conference in Lisbon with Pedro Amaral and Manuel also in the speaker lineup. So that you know, if you're listening on to this webinar, you have a very special discount offer of 25%. You can see it below and you'll see it in the final email, valid until Monday. So this is a special treat for you, but let's dig into the webinar. But before some practical technical notes. If you have any issues with technicalities, if you can't hear or you can't see the slides, just drop a note on the chat button. We have a technical expert behind the screen to help you, as well as questions. We really urge you to submit your questions throughout the webinar because we want to be able to answer as many of them as possible so that the experts can let you know what their thoughts are. And finally, I'd like to start introductions with Manuel Costera da Rocha, currently the Commercial Director of Hydrogen at Smart Energy. But I'll let Manuel introduce him briefly himself and maybe give a fact on what his work is now currently related to green hydrogen.
Yeah, thank you, Lorena, for the presentation, for the invitation to be here with you. I did start my career 30 years ago after graduating in Oporto University, and I joined Siemens for a couple of years, almost 10 years, and then I joined also EFASEC for a couple of years, so my heart is somehow split in between these two companies. But after being in Mozambique and South Africa, in Africa for a couple of years, I did return to Europe, and I tried to approach a new sector, a new energy paradigm that was starting in 2019. Sorry. And I found hydrogen a very nice opportunity, and joining Smart Energy, I had a chance to start developing interesting projects all over Europe, which was really a nice challenge and good motivation for these coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. So I will move on and introduce Miguel Valles, currently the Director of System Business Unit at EFASEC, whose Manuel's heart is a little bit tied to as well. But Miguel, similar question for you. Can you give a brief introduction and how is your work currently related to green hydrogen?
Sure. So Lorena, thank you first of all for the opportunity, and very pleased to be here and sharing panel with Manuel, which I've known from his prior tenure here at EFASEC, and also with Pedro. Well, basically, EFASEC is a Portuguese-based engineering and technology company. I would say well known for the majority of our attendees today, and obviously we've been looking to the hydrogen segment as a major opportunity, not only for the country but for the energy and industry sectors here in Portugal, but also in Europe. And so what EFASEC did was basically define a strategic roadmap where it put all its core competencies from the energy systems, mainly renewables and grid integration, and also from our thermal and more conventional competencies in cogenerations and combined cycles, and created a multidisciplinary team to tackle these challenges that are currently I would say in several boards and concerns of several key stakeholders of the market. And what we've been doing is put all our technical expertise at the disposal of our customers and partners to help address this exciting new segment. And very glad to be here once again.
Thank you, Miguel. So last but not least, we have Pedro Amaral Jorge, the president of APREN, the Renewable Energy Association in Portugal. And Pedro, you also have an impressive CV, but I'll let you briefly introduce yourself and give a fact about what is green hydrogen, or what does that focus on your working life nowadays.
Well, thank you very much, Lorena, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and share this very interesting, I hope so, panel with Manuel and Miguel. We all know each other from previously experiences in this energy sector. Well, I've worked in South America, Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. I work in the natural gas, water and sanitation and renewable power sectors. And I had the luck and fortunate to work from engineering to financier to developer to banker in all of this that is regarding water and energy transition. So what I'm doing for the past 3 years almost is that I was invited to become the CEO of the board of directors of APREN. APREN is a national association that represents 90% of all renewable power in Portugal, and our scope goes from electricity generation to storage to green hydrogen and also to distributed solar installations. And we work with all technologies, so wind, hydro, PV, geothermal, onshore, offshore, floating PV. So we are from the renewable sector and not technology specific. So in terms of the green hydrogen, what we've been doing is, and I've been repeating myself almost for 2 years now, is the most efficient way to actually decarbonize the economy is through direct electrification with resources of renewable energy to actually do that. But where direct electrification is not achievable, green hydrogen is a way to indirectly electrify consumptions through the usage of water electrolysis with access to renewable power. So what we've been doing here is we are trying to design policy, to design stabilization of markets, trying to liaise with the government and debate what are the support mechanisms that are required to create the supply and demand for this market. We are always looking at levelized cost of hydrogen as a competitive way for Portugal to increase its competitiveness in terms of exporting it. So basically, policy, projects, funding, and bankability, this is what I've been pursuing over the past 2 years regarding only green hydrogen.
Perfect. And we'll definitely be touching on some of those key topics today. But before we do so, I think I just want to start by creating a brief overview of the current Portuguese market. And below you'll see two graphs. The one on the left is showcases two different things. On the left-hand side, you'll see it's a capacity, renewable capacity for every month, I think from May 2019 to May 2021. On the right, it's actually prices. And it's just to see a bit of the distribution of the renewable energy generation. But perhaps that's more clear on the graph to the right, which is focused on PV. So that's the PV installed capacity in Portugal in megawatts from 2011 to 2020, which is consistently growing and expected to grow even further. And this, of course, will tie in closely to the green hydrogen production, since the input to produce green hydrogen is renewable electricity. And right now we're looking at PV, but I'm sure in Portugal, wind is also a very big factor. So you can see here on the right-hand side on the pie graph, that's the 2020 market share for renewables. So hydro is of course the main share of renewable energy in Portugal, and second wind, and now PV. But I do believe PV is the fastest growing one currently. Well, there's a lot more of the pie to fill with PV, and it's definitely something that ties into this topic. In the left, if you're interested, you can see the PV generation per region in Portugal over the past 10 years. But I think I'm going to skip that so that we can get to the experts very soon. But just so you know, Portugal has a very ambitious national plan goal, and below, unfortunately, it's in Portuguese, but those are some of their goals for 2030. And they really want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% to 55% by 2030. And I will be very curious to hear how does green hydrogen tie into these goals, or maybe will it help surpass these goals? Finally, I just wanted to put out some points for the attendees, but please let us know. At this point, I think people are quite used to the topic of green hydrogen, but I just wanted to confirm. So the technology necessary to produce green hydrogen is already mature. That's water electrolysis and renewable energy production. And we'll go over then what is really needed to create this ecosystem of green hydrogen in Portugal in a moment, actually right now. I want to kickstart the conversation with the attendees, in fact. I would like to kickstart the conversation with a poll question, and you should see it in the screen. And I'd like to ask the attendees, what do you believe? I believe green hydrogen will become cost competitive with natural gas in the next, is it less than 5 years? Is it 5 to 10, over 10 years, or perhaps never? Like, how bullish are you on this topic? Please vote. We'd love to see what your input is. But I think I will begin this question and turn to, I'm going to say Pedro. And what are your initial thoughts to this question?
Well, I think we need two variables to actually look at this, which is the price of CO2 and the efficiency of electrolyzers, both the capex reduction in terms of the manufacturing capability that needs to be achieved and power costs. So I think between 5 to 10 years, if we do the math and we keep the ETS system, then I think year 5 will be completely cost competitive.
Wow, well, you can see the results of the attendees right now. Anything surprising for you?
No, the only thing is this is technologically and market-driven feasible. What we need to make sure in order to create this demand is that we have the proper license and permitting processes, and that governments through state aid or any other CFD systems of stabilizing the market make sure that bankability through project finance is achieved. Otherwise, this is going to take, this phase will not be achievable if we are only considering that only corporate loans or equity should be used into this energy transition regarding green hydrogen.
All right, thank you, Pedro. But now I'll kickstart a question to the panel, and I'll remove the slides for now since we will be speaking ourselves. And I'll direct the question to you, Manuel, because you're coming into this from like an investor perspective, and I wanted to know in terms of bankability, or what are key features of green hydrogen projects, or what do you see as the future for green hydrogen in Portugal in your experience?
Well, I think that there is a fantastic future ahead of us for hydrogen in Portugal, because relevant sectors are not cannot be decarbonized by electrification. So we really need an alternative, and hydrogen is for sure the alternative. We have two challenges that are at present very important, relevant for the project deployment. One is the funding gap that is really needs. We just spoke about the competitiveness of hydrogen when comparing with natural gas. So there is a gap that we somehow need to fill. And the other big challenge has to do with the off-taker, because at the present we don't have yet green H2 market in place. Meaning that to make projects feasible, we really need to somehow de-risk the operations, and for this we need to work on the demand side. So it's really important to identify the right partners, the partners that could help us on de-risking the operations, and that's the challenge we are, let's say, taking, and the motivation is very high on this particular topic. We understood already that there are relevant stakeholders that are happy to discuss with us these opportunities, which is of course relevant. And I believe that in the coming months, the progress will be very impressive in the sense that there will be more clarity on these de-risking, let's say, approaches.
And Miguel, are these similar challenges that you are facing at FSI?
Well, we actually have different challenges. So basically, the conversations that we've been having with our partners and clients are in a way to better understand, or those clients and partners want to understand better if the technology is indeed mature, and what it would be needed to put in place in order to, as Manuel said, to mitigate some risks, in this case technology risks, which have obviously a direct impact in the profitability of the projects. I like the statement, the opening statement where you said that this is already mature. Yes, it is. So it's a technology that exists, electrolysis, for example. It's a technology that exists, I believe, since the late 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. But obviously, what we've been dealing here, and especially on the green hydrogen, is that one should be talking about an entire system. I will simplify and go on the solar example, for example. So when we are talking about production of green hydrogen powered by, for example, a solar plant, one should see this as an old system, a solar plus hydrogen system, and for that, obviously, another type of challenges pose, such as monitoring the system as a whole, properly integrating it in order to maximize, and obviously, the capacity factors and the efficiency that Pedro mentioned previously. And if you start adding complexity, and if you start mixing sources of renewable generation with, for example, solar plus wind, and eventually, why not, biomass from a different perspective, which I'll reach there in some minutes, then you add complexity, you add some risk, but obviously you need you need to look into a system as a whole, and that's the dimensioning of those systems. That's the type of discussions that we've been having from one side. On the other side, we've been having a much broader perspective, conversations with several partners and relevant stakeholders here in Portugal for other types of hydrogen production on a more larger scale. But I will leave that for some minutes, which I believe we will get there.
Yes, I'm sure we'll get there. But you're really touching upon the point of systems, Miguel, and that's something that I want to then direct that question to Pedro. And like, what are the triggers then that will kickstart the green hydrogen ecosystem in Portugal in particular? Maybe they've already been put in place, or really, what are the triggers for the ecosystem in Portugal for green hydrogen?
Well, as I mentioned, what Portugal has as advantage is the portfolio of renewable resources between hydro, wind, and sun, and with levelized costs of electricity that we have tested on auctions, and that we've seen also in Spain for wind, that we are below 30 euros per megawatt hour. And so the trigger is the OPEX is there and it can be competitive. Now, as I mentioned to you previously, there is the process of license and permitting, which is not unique for Portugal. It's something all over Europe. I participate in a lot of European associations meetings regarding this topic, and this is something that the European Commission needs to address with all member states. But Portugal, if it moves earlier in simplifying license and permitting, will have here also a competitive advantage to making sure that they have the first systems installed before other countries do. Then we have these support mechanisms that we need to address. Initially, it was thought that the support mechanisms will be from the supply side. Then the government publicly announced that it will be from the demand side. And I think we need both, because we need to achieve levelized cost of hydrogen very competitive on the next 5 years. And in order to do this, you need to gain economies of scale and you need predictability in terms of your demand. Otherwise, your financing structures will not be effective and will not leverage the capability that is required. Then Portugal has all of this, and we need to make sure of one thing that is important. Of course, PV will be a huge part of generating green hydrogen, but it's only 1,800 hours per year. And so we need to blend this with either winds, or we need to make sure that you have a complex system, as Miguel was mentioning, that we have grid access plus self-consumption on PV and wind. What we are very happy and fortunate in Portugal is that our target for renewable electricity incorporation and consumption will be 80% in 2030, but in 2021 we already achieved that. Our average of renewables incorporated in consumption for electricity over the past 5 months, I don't have the June results yet, but up to May was 72%. So if you mix all of this, you will be achieving several targets. One, support mechanisms will reduce levelized cost of hydrogen. And together with making sure that you have 4,000 hours or more of available power from renewable sources, blending winds with PV will allow it to be completely green. If you make sure that you have your support mechanisms there through CFDs according to the Renewables Directive, you'll be making sure that a lot of financial players and a lot of investors can come to the game, because it's about the project, it's not about how deep your pockets are and the size of your balance sheet. So I think Portugal can aggregate all of this, and there is my personal conviction that this can be achieved, and this is something that I fight every day for, to make sure that the variables are there, everything is transparent, and that people understand this, and we don't go into the making sure that we create fake news about hydrogen is very expensive, it's very dangerous, it's this and that, because we don't have time to do that when it comes to climate change fight.
Mm-hmm. Well, then maybe talking a little bit about bankability, and you're already mentioning levelized cost of hydrogen, or maybe actually what I wanted to refer is a bit on the investment side. I actually want to ask first the question to the audience, another poll question, but I would also like to remind the audience that they can also pose questions to us. But until they do so, I will ask them questions. And the question is, if they were to invest in Portugal, in the Portuguese market, would they feel confident to invest or develop projects related to green hydrogen in Portugal in the next 5 years? Perhaps they are already doing so, as some of our panelists. They are considering it, they would not consider it, or undecided. It would be very nice to have a feel for what would people do if they had the opportunity to invest in green hydrogen in Portugal in the next 5 years. And for this topic, I'll actually turn to Manuel and a bit of your experience from an investment perspective.
So Manuel goes first?
Yes, if Manuel would like to.
Well, we definitely believe that these projects in Portugal are a very nice opportunity for us in terms of investment, and we trust that Portugal will keep being a very, let's say, reliable place to invest, in the sense that the market conditions, the regulatory framework, legislation, everything will be put in place to make the investment well, I'd say de-risked as much as possible. So in this sense, I think that Portugal is a nice place to invest. We are already investing in some projects here in Portugal, and for sure we'll continue.
Yeah, and perhaps just to quickly follow up on that question, what would be the ideal makeup of a project with green hydrogen that would be very attractive to invest in? And I'll still stay with you, Manuel, but then maybe turn to Pedro.
Yeah, you know that at present we have in Portugal a challenge that is the existing users of hydrogen in Portugal, grey hydrogen, of course, are very few. So we can count 3 or 4. And these hydrogen users are already served by their own, let's say, procurement. And we have to identify in the country other potential users. And what could be more effective is to, while we scale up the demand, for example, in mobility, we can take advantage of the gas grid injection, trying at the same time to decarbonize the gas consumers while scaling up the demand on other sectors, like, for example, on mobility. So we believe that this way we can balance and we can launch the basis for the ecosystem deployment in the first phase.
Sounds good. And Pedro, were you surprised by the results we had? Actually, over 0.5% of the participants are considering investing in green hydrogen in Portugal.
Well, I think I'm not surprised. I thought that people that are already doing the investment in Portugal will be slightly higher, but 52% of investment intentions, it's quite good. And I think based on what the European Commission has been publishing through the Renewable Hydrogen Coalition, through Hydrogen Europe, we all know now that it's going to be sector coupling and it's going to be renewable power and hydrogen, and the majority of it renewable hydrogen. Just going back to something that Manuel mentioned, which I think is quite important, it's we need to do this with private sector money. We are not going to do all of this through public funding. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to ask taxpayers to actually fund this. What we need to do is ask energy consumers to actually be able, with economical affordability, to pay for this. So why is it so important, green hydrogen blending on a natural gas pipeline? Because you generate a huge demand through all sectors, domestic, corporates, and industrials, and you don't have to do almost no investment on the capex, because if you burn 95% of methane, natural gas, and 5 to 10% of hydrogen, what the studies say today is that the amount of investment you need to do to change the burners, it's minimum. So you will be generating a huge demand. And what happens when huge demands are generated, you need to incentivize supply to do it. If investors see that there is long-term targets to be achieved, that the demand is there, and there is initially for market generation a last resource trader, this is going to ramp up very fast. What we need to do this through project finance. I always keep saying this because the clean energy package, it's actually about making sure that we democratize energy access, and not only for consumers, but also for business units. A lot of the companies that work through all Europe, the majority of it are SMEs, and SMEs need that projects are worth as much as balance sheet of big companies, and this is what we need to do. And that is why grid injection is important. That's why mechanism stabilization of price is important. That's why license and permitting is important, because the rest, which is something that you are fortunate to have or not, Portugal fortunately has it. So we have very good universities, very good professionals. We have very good renewable resources. What we need is guidance on the terms of having the policy that it needs to be put in place, properly addressed for private sector to jump into this, and to make sure that, as we saw with levelized cost of electricity for wind and for PV over 10 years, I think that can be achievable for a levelized cost of hydrogen in the next 5. So if we do that, and if carbon prices keep increasing above 50 euros per ton, then you're on the money. This is not only beneficial from an environmental point of view, it's actually a soundable and feasible business, which can be bankable, and we don't have to be supporting with public money. What we need is legal framework, regulatory stability, and the support mechanisms to make sure that investors are jumping into the game.
Well, thank you for that, Pedro. And I just wanted to touch perhaps on a bit of more technical side from what you mentioned, because you touched upon the topic of blending or injecting green hydrogen into the grid. And perhaps that question I'll turn to Miguel, like really about the integration of green hydrogen with the existing technologies or the existing infrastructure in Portugal, because that also seems to be a point of contention when it comes to the topic.
Well, there are some pilots actually that came to public. One of them actually is about to blend up to 20% of a small community in the region of Lisbon for one of the gas operators we have here in Portugal. The thing is that you do know that hydrogen is quite a different element, in this case gas, than natural gas. So it's much more volatile, and when in combustion it can reach very high temperatures, especially when compared to natural gas. So I agree with Pedro on the I would say on the residential side. If we are able to maintain a certain percentage of the hydrogen blending with the existing natural gas, so we don't foresee any type of complexity or problems in the deployment of those percentages. Now, when we talk about having larger amounts of blending, one needs to take into account also that the I don't know exactly if this is the technical term, but calorific power of the hydrogen is also different from the natural gas. And all of our existing network here in Portugal has a certain advantage with other existing networks in Europe, because it was built more recently, and it is therefore more capable of having this higher percentage of hydrogen, being not an expert in the matter. But there are good and positive outlooks on the matter. But on the demand side, which was the point that Pedro was having, we also agreed that will be a key element in terms of market creation for the deployment of the segment, because obviously Portugal has a different profile, a different industrial profile than other countries in Central Europe, such as Germany or the Netherlands, and we need to complement this on this early stage in the market creation. Obviously, with the residential bringing on board, and the blending of hydrogen and natural gas is obviously something that we need. It we think it will be important.
Indeed. And I think I'm going to jump to some questions from the audience, because there's quite a few. My mouse was stuck on just one. So for the longest time, I was like, we only have one question, and then I expanded and there's more. So I'll jump into one now. And the question is, what is currently the available minimum capacity in kilowatts for hydrogen electrical power generation? And how much is the current production cost of hydrogen? So I guess this question was,
sorry, Lorena, I didn't understand the initial part of the question.
What is currently the minimum capacity for hydrogen electrical power generation? I think I would rephrase this question to, what is currently the minimum amount of maybe a plant or electricity generation that is then being used to produce green hydrogen, or going to an electrolyzer?
Yeah, I can go on a rule of thumb if you want. So you have, depending on the project, for example, a solar plus hydrogen project, you could have a 2-to-1 or a 1.5-to-1 ratio between solar generation and electrolyzing capacity. That's
power to power. So 50 megawatts of PV to 35 megawatt of electrolyzer.
Mm-hmm. power to power.
Okay,
Yes,
that's a ratio, but there is an amount of energy that it's constant that you need to change to transform water into hydrogen and oxygen, and that's chemistry, and it's the same whatever type of energy you use.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. And then I'll jump into another one. I think that maybe you could answer, Pedro. Is do you think that Portugal will meet the target of between 2 and 2.5 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030, as set out by the National Hydrogen Strategy?
Let me answer you on a different way. I think we cannot afford not to meet that target. Because, and I'm going to give you 3 reasons why, which people tend to forget. The COVID killed a very relevant part of the Portuguese economy, which was lodging, restaurants, and tourism. And this is going to take a while to recoup. It's not going to be next year or the year after. Our public debt to GDP ratio will arrive at 138% by the end of the year. So we need all the external funding that we need to actually develop this economy. What the government predicted, and we can adjust that number, was that to install 2 to 2.5 gigawatts of electrolyzers, you will be capturing 7 billion euros of private sector investment. And the only thing you needed for that was around 600 million from public support. So I think if we are not able to actually see that the multiplication effect on 2.5 gigawatt, because it's not only the electrolyzers, then it's the renewable power you need to do it. Then it's the transmission, distribution, grid. Then it's the water access. Then it's the storage. Then the distribution. If you scale up the economy factor and you use a very conservative number for €1 that you can invest in electrolyzers itself, you can multiply it by 2 in terms of the overall effect on the economy. I think we cannot afford not to achieve it, to be honest with you. And I think it will be highly irresponsible if policymakers and governments don't understand this and they let themselves captured by populism and opinions that this is going to explode and this is very dangerous and all of that. I think we are beyond that now, both from a climate perspective and from a macroeconomic perspective for Portugal.
All right. And I was going to ask if that extends to beyond Portugal. Is that also your vision for Europe or globally, or are you really talking about Portugal?
I think Manuel wanted to say something, but I'm just going to say this and pass the word to him. As I mentioned today previously, I participate in a lot of the national associations from hydrogen, PV, and wind. What I can tell you now is that the initial documents for Germany, for Spain, are already outdated. Reality, when you look at the projects that are published on the European Commission site, are much more than were initially on the strategies. So I think, yes, we are going to go beyond up to 2030 of what we have as targets for the European Union.
Yeah. No, I'd like to add some ideas on top of what Pedro said. At present, and for the investors, money is not an issue because we have available and enough money to invest. The only thing that we really require is a stable regulatory framework and some measures to de-risk the business. So this is really the key to be successful on this particular ecosystem, and it's quite simple to understand it. Then we have an industrial challenge. I think that everyone agrees that this COVID showed us that we could not rely on the Chinese factories to develop Europe. We have to have our own industry, and for this reason, all the H2 ecosystem, the green H2 ecosystem, has to be based mainly, not only, but mainly in European technology and European manufacturers. So I think that companies, not only in Portugal, but all over Europe, have to, let's say, put in place strategies to really increase their capacity to produce equipments to then be used on the plants that are foreseen for the future. And 2 gigawatt of electrolyzers is a huge amount of electrolyzers, believe me. and also the renewable energy equipments that are required for this green H2 production are also very, very relevant. So we have to keep in mind that this is also an opportunity for the industry to develop. And talking about industry, of course, we have these, let's say, SMEs, like Pedro was saying before, that really work together with the big brands and with the big manufacturers. We have the R&D institutions that also need to deploy. So it's a complete ecosystem that needs to be deployed, and it's really a change in the paradigm, not only in the energy sector, but all over the economy. I think that it's really something that we really need to face and to pursue.
Miguel, do you allow me just to mention one thing before I hand over to you, before I forget, because I'm getting old and then things move away from my head, and you guys are much younger than I am. So one of the things that Manuel mentioned, which is very important, and we need to look at this like a puzzle, we are installing the industrialization directive in Europe to make sure that we capture jobs here and that companies pay taxes here. We are developing the European Green Deal with the carbon border tax adjustment to make sure that we don't import CO2 from other regions in the world instead of producing it here. And what Manuel is mentioning as de-risking is what we call, it's developers are absorbing all the risk. If you think of a project, you have development risk to start with, then you have permitting risk, then you have construction risk, then you have delay risk, then you have operational risk, then you have market risk. The only thing that investors and developers are asking is we cannot cope with volume and price risk also, at least not now, until a demand is created. And this is financing one-on-one. It comes on the first page. In order for you to generate a market, to leverage your money, you need to make sure that banks lend you. And if you have some savings in your bank, don't you want to make sure that after 5 years they are still there? If money is lent this money to projects to generate profit, we need to make sure that the money is returned back to all the investors and the people that save money in a way that we don't go back to 2008 and we saw Lehman Brothers being AAA on a Monday and bankrupt on a Thursday. So this is all engaged. We need to make sure that technology, policy, investment, we all look in the same lens and the common ground that we need to achieve this. Sorry, Miguel.
No, I fully agree with what you said, Manuel. Let me just streamline a couple of things just to highlight one important topic. So reshoring, definitely, Manuel, I totally agree with that vision, and I believe that's something that the European Commission is fully aware of. And the fact that we cannot lose the opportunity to reach that target. Let me just highlight one thing. So we are using some assumptions based on the cost decline of the electrolyzer technology. So that's everybody is modeling nowadays, assuming that the price will go below I don't know, 900. Today's 900 kilowatt hours, something like that. But everything's everyone's modeling to price decreases around 80-90% within the next years. For that to happen, we need to have this ramp up of the industry ASAP. It needs to be today. Otherwise, we won't be able to be cost competitive at the time that everybody is expecting that we will be cost competitive by 9 years from now. So we need to do that ramp up, and it needs to be done now. And one of the things that we feel is that there is a lot of interest. There is a lot of interest in collaboration, in pursuing projects, smaller and larger or medium scale. That doesn't matter. But if we don't act as an ecosystem and fully in collaboration, that just simply won't happen.
I agree.
And when I say acting in coordination and collaboration, it means thinking of this from a cross-border perspective, and obviously taking advantage of the good engineering and technology knowledge that we have here in Europe, and that will definitely be decisive for that deployment.
So there's some great messages, and it's clear that all three of you are aligned on those messages. We still have a few minutes, so I think I'll try to have those couple questions from the audience before we have a final poll up on the screen. And perhaps this question is a question I have here is from Maynard Clark. It's where are green hydrogen fuel cells used? So really the application of where are these used, perhaps in this for me, I'm also thinking, what are the main off-takers for green hydrogen in Portugal? Where do you see the off-takers? Where are they in the ecosystem that we're talking about? And if you could provide some clarity on this.
Are you asking me? Manuel.
Whoever answers first, I guess.
No, let Manuel go first, and I would like just to make a comment in the end if he doesn't cover it. Manuel, go ahead.
Okay. So you can consider hydrogen as something interesting, either as a feedstock or as an energy vector. Okay, as a feedstock, as I did comment before, in Portugal you have 3, 4, 5 companies that are existing H2 users, and of course these are potentially interesting off-takers for H2 projects. So it's very simple, because they only need to change from gray to green, which is of course very easy. Well, we put it very easy because we don't want to do complicated things. Yeah. In terms of energy vector, of course, in some energy intensive consumers like the glass industry, ceramics, cement, and others, of course you need to change from one energy vector, natural gas, to another energy vector. And in these sectors, you need to properly address the technology changes that you need to do in the burners, in the boilers, in other equipments, and we need to work together on this change. As Miguel was saying before, we need to partner, we need to work together in all the ecosystem, on the production side, on the demand side as well, trying to make things happen in a coordinated way. So it is really important to do it together. So in terms of off-takers, these are the key industries that are potentially off-takers from green hydrogen. And then we have the mobility sector, of course, which is a huge challenge, in the sense that you need to put in place a network of refilling stations that could then supply the vehicles, and these vehicles will be deployed, will be made available by the OEMs as soon as we have this infrastructure. So again, here we have to balance demand with the production, but these are mainly the off-takers that we have in Portugal.
Right, now, Pedro, you wanted to add one more point?
No, I think then if we put the natural gas consumers spread on the domestic appliance, we have another huge volume of off-taking that needs to be agreed in terms of what are the minimum balances, because this is where we actually get a market mixture that could work in Portugal, and I've been advocating this. If you create a last resource trader that gives you a regulated market, and then those projects gain the minimum economy of scale and bankability to go into the liberalized markets and grow on demand with shorter term contracts, with more demand risk, with more volatility, but we have the base for bankability, this will ramp up. And so you need to complement both demands, in my opinion.
All right. Thank you.
Let me just add a tech-geek perspective on the matter. FSEC is about to sign off a small pilot, a demonstrator here in our facilities in Porto, in Maia, for small scale, very small scale production of hydrogen based on some solar rooftop that we have there, Yes, to fill up a couple of fuel cells that we will be attaching to an electrical board of another demonstrator that we have of battery energy storage. So that's a completely new world and perspective beyond what Manuel and Pedro just referred. But I think it's an interesting perspective to see how that sector coupling concept that Pedro mentioned previously could eventually get together from a technology perspective.
It's a great input, Miguel. Thank you. And I think I want to launch the last poll question to the audience before we close off this webinar. And the question is, I believe the main bottleneck to the deployment of green hydrogen on a large scale is technology integration, bankability and levelized cost of hydrogen, the regulatory framework, changing the existing infrastructure, or licensing and permitting. And I think we've touched on a few of these points, or even all of them throughout this talk, and I think I can already kind of tell what our panelists are thinking. I'll give a bit of time for the audience to vote. But I want to ask you, Pedro, first, but I don't want your answer to affect people who are still thinking. So I will close the poll now because I think you have a very clear opinion on what the main bottleneck is to deploy this technology. I'll let you go ahead, Pedro.
So what I think is technology is important, but if you cannot install it, it will not do you any good. And it's really interesting that you can get all of the theoretical reduction of levelized cost of electricity with projects that are not bankable, even if they are feasible, that wouldn't work. Because we need to have two things here. Everything starts with project development. So project development is where you put your initial money and you start involving your teams and liaising with the authorities. If the process is very complex, very intricate, difficult to achieve, difficult to explain to your investors, like saying, why can you not get a production license? Well, because X entity with Y, Z, it's embarrassing. So you need to streamline that. Once that is done, then you got your production license. You can go and build, okay? But no one will give you the money to build if your market, it's not clear in terms of project finance to make sure that you can actually make your cash flow stable and you can put a lot of money into this project. So I would say license and permitting first, and then bankability. If you solve those two, I think then the rest will evolve, because for technology to improve, you need demand of buying products. If there's no demand because there are no projects, then technology will not improve. So in my opinion, the first two pillars is licensing and permitting, and then bankability and reduction of levelized cost of hydrogen.
Right, I'll put the result up for us to see if that was a similar, but I guess people were actually focusing more on the bankability rather than licensing and permitting. And I'll ask you, Miguel, what would you have voted for?
No. Well, I wouldn't vote technology integration because obviously. Sorry?
No, just saying that's because you're an expert on technology integration.
No, I would say probably bankability and levelized cost of hydrogen, but the regulatory framework is also important. Let me just comment on one particular topic. We already mentioned previously, but if we are to create a large scale or mass market hydrogen production in Portugal, if we aim for that, so most likely we will need to have we will need to get some of the electricity from the grid. And lucky for us, we're in Portugal, and hopefully within the next years we will be very near 100% renewable generation here in Portugal, and that's something that we need to raise and to praise for being a country with that percentage of renewables. But as we analyze these larger projects, we are more convinced as time passes by that the concept of auto consumption, of remote auto consumption, means not having to pay for grid access tariffs for the supply of our projects. That would be very important to have in mind from a regulatory point of view. And obviously that has a direct impact in the profitability of the industries that would be willing to bet and would be willing to participate on that mass market deployment of green hydrogen.
All right, and I think I'd like to put the results up just one more time to also hear from Manuel. Manuel, what would you have voted for?
Well, I can give you a perspective of a company that is already licensing and permitting projects. So we have real experience on this topic. And in our opinion, the most, let's say, challenging from these 5 is the licensing and the permitting. Sometimes not because the process is too complex, but rather because there is no process yet established.
Exactly.
So we are building the framework, all of us, and the government, of course, the governments. And I think that this is the real challenge at the present, because sometimes people don't know how to license. When we submit an application, the institutions don't know how to manage that, and this is really a big challenge. And talking about permitting is more or less the challenge is more or less the same as the regulatory framework as well, because we are also building this framework. And in our opinion, these are the 2 main challenges. Of course, the other topics are very important, but as I used to say, those we can pay with money. But putting together frameworks for permitting and for regulatory, it's not depending on money. So it's really depending on the willingness to make things happen, and it is priceless.
Well, thank you for those comments.
Allow me just one thing, without not getting into, as Miguel was saying, very geek financial technical. When you assume bankability, that assumes that the regulatory framework allows you to bank the project. Okay, so that's why when we say bankability, it comprehends that the regulatory framework is there. But even if you have a good regulatory framework that allows bankability and you have the support mechanisms, if you don't have licensing and permitting working in, let's say, what we need 2 years from concept to production license, there is the real bottleneck, because that delays everything, and then you will create a bubble where everyone is looking for people, for EPCs, for companies all at the same time, and you're going to create an unbalance between the demand and the supply of equipment, of EPCs, of labor, of the experts, of consultants. And so that's why I mentioned initially that it's license and permitting and bankability, assuming that regulatory framework stability and support mechanisms are included on bankability concepts.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. I think right now I'll put the slides back up because we're reaching the end of our webinar, and all 3 of you have provided some great input and insight on the Portuguese green hydrogen market, but I think also that insight could extend even beyond just Portugal. But it really points towards a country who has all of the drivers for green hydrogen, or all of the resources available, and it's a matter of creating that ecosystem for green hydrogen to flourish, and the steps are there. But perhaps I will ask each of you if you have one final message on the topic, particularly towards, let's say, PV solar professionals, since that tends to be most of our attendees, in relation to green hydrogen in Portugal. I'll start from what I see left to right here, and Manuel, you're first in my list. Do you have a final message for this webinar?
Yes, maybe the message that I'd like to pass here is that we really need to coordinate our efforts in terms of green H2 ecosystem deployment. So we need real coordination in terms of production and demand. So I would be very happy to cooperate with some stakeholders that are on the off-taking side, trying as much as possible to deploy the usage of green hydrogen to decarbonize some usages in the industry, for example. Thank you.
Perfect, Manuel. And well, I'll close in the end. I'll first move on to Miguel. Same question to you.
No, just we will always have curtailment in renewables, and so green hydrogen is obviously a green hydrogen production and storage could be an excellent way of adding value to existing and or developing projects. And technology will be and is an enabler and a positive driver of this segment, and hopefully we will be able to reach and aim the target that Pedro mentioned at the beginning.
Indeed, and Pedro, I'll give you the floor.
Well, I'm going to give you a very optimistic message, which I believe the ecosystem of PV and solar, when you look at Greece, south of France, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, your targets in terms of your demand for projects is going to increase as the green hydrogen increases beyond the direct electrification of renewable electricity. So if you look at your national energy and climate plans and you look at what is going to be required for self-consumption approach, because then you can control your prices of power and making sure that you reduce them as further as you can, it's going to generate a market that will be at least 50% more than it was initially just for the targets of the national energy and climate plans for ground mounted PV and also decentralized on rooftops.
Well, thank you so much, Pedro, and Miguel and Manuel for these final comments, particularly directed towards PV and renewable professionals. I want to comment that there are quite a few questions that went unanswered, so I will perhaps try to combine the answers to those questions with the three of you via email and share with the attendees. But I would also like to close this webinar and thank you again for the conversation. I think green hydrogen is a very hot topic, but it's conversations like these that help demystify it. There is a lot of news articles about it, but there are questions that only experts can answer. So thank you so much for your participation today. It was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you,
with that, I will.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.